What if the thing that puts your North Carolina plumbing license at risk isn't the failed inspection, but what happens after the failed inspection? Because a lot of plumbers think the real problem is the code issue itself, when a lot of times it's really not. A lot of times the bigger problem is what happens once that issue turns into a complaint. Because maybe the homeowner gets angry about it, maybe the GC wants somebody to blame, maybe the inspector notes something that raises bigger questions with the plumbing board, right? That happens sometimes. Or maybe what should have been a correction item turns into an accusation that the work was careless, unsafe, or never should have been done a specific way in the first place. What I've seen is once that happens, you may not be dealing with just a job problem anymore. You may be dealing with a license issue. And that's where a lot of plumbers really do get blindsided, because by the time they realize how serious a matter is, they've already said something, they've emailed something, or they've done something that makes it worse. So if you hold a plumbing license in North Carolina, this is something you need to understand. I'm Nick Dogle. I'm a North Carolina attorney with North State Law here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And my practice focuses on helping licensed professionals protect their licenses and deal with board complaints, also with investigations and disciplinary issues. If you're a plumber, a plumbing contractor, or a licensed trades professional in North Carolina, this is one of those issues that can become serious faster than people expect. Because a lot of license trouble doesn't start with somebody trying to do something dishonest. It really doesn't. A lot of times it starts with something much more ordinary. It could be something as simple as a light code issue, or maybe a disagreement over the work, and you could have a correction that doesn't get handled the right way. That happens sometimes. Also, you could have a complaint that starts getting framed as something bigger than it first seemed. So in this video, I will walk you through how a code violation complaint can put your plumbing license at risk, what regulators may actually care about, where plumbers often make the situation worse, and what you need to be thinking about before you respond. One of the biggest mistakes licensed professionals make is assuming that if something starts as a construction issue, it's going to stay a construction issue. That is not always how this works. A code problem may start as a correction issue. It may start as a failed inspection. It may start as a disagreement over how something was installed, for example. But once somebody turns that into a complaint and starts framing it as something like poor workmanship, unsafe installation, lack of supervision, or sloppy professional conduct, now you're in a different category. Now the question may not just be, well, was this item installed correctly? Now the question may become, was this work done competently? Was it supervised properly? Was the licensed individual actually involved the way they should have been? And how did they handle it once the issue was raised? And that's the shift people miss, because a lot of plumbers think they're defending the job when what they really need to understand is they may be defending their license. And once it becomes a license issue, the way you handle it matters a lot more than people realize. So let's start with the first big point. Not every code issue actually becomes a disciplinary issue with the board, but almost any code issue can become a complaint. And once there's a complaint, everything changes. Now, to be clear, jobs fail inspections all the time. Corrections happen all the time. And that in and of itself does not automatically mean you're headed toward board trouble. But here's where things start going sideways. A lot of complaints don't come from the first inspection result. They come from what happens after that. Maybe the correction doesn't get handled very quickly or at all. Maybe the homeowner feels ignored. Maybe the GC says, you're holding up the project. Also, maybe you didn't call in a follow-up inspection quickly enough. Maybe the inspector's notes make it sound like this wasn't just a small issue when really it was. It could have been something that should have been caught much earlier. And once that happens, the story starts changing. It's no longer just, this needs to be fixed. Now it becomes, should this person have done the work this way in the first place? Or even, should this person be trusted to hold a license? And that's a very different problem. Let's say Paul is a licensed plumbing contractor working on a residential remodel. We get a final inspection comes around and a few issues get flagged. Maybe there's a venting issue, maybe there's a fixture clearance problem, maybe there's a drainage concern. At that point, that may still just be a job correction issue. But then the homeowner starts making complaints that Paul stopped returning calls. The GC says that the delay is costing money, and then the inspector's comments suggest at least one of the issues should have been obvious much earlier. Now Paul isn't just dealing with the correction list anymore. He's dealing with a whole narrative created by multiple people. And in these cases, narrative matters because licensing problems often get built not just from the original issue, but from how the professional handled the issue once it came up. And this is another place where a lot of plumbers get caught off guard. They think, I just need to prove the inspector was wrong. And maybe sometimes that's true. Maybe the inspector is wrong. That happens sometimes. And maybe there really is a legitimate disagreement about the code. But even if that's the case, that may not be the only thing anybody is looking at. Because if this becomes a board complaint or regulatory issue, they may be looking at several things at the same time. First thing that they might look at is obviously going to be competency. And that question becomes, was the work performed in a way that meets professional standards? The second one is supervision. If someone else under your license did the work, were you actually supervising the way a license holder is expected to? Third one is responsibility. Was the permit process handled correctly? Was the scope of the job clear? Was the job being managed appropriately? And then next thing that we look at is, conduct after the complaint. And this one matters a lot more than people think. How did you respond once the issue was raised? Did you handle it professionally? Or did you get defensive? Did you get emotional? Did you get inconsistent or even careless? Because a lot of these cases get worse after the complaint. Not because of the original work done. They get worse because somebody sends a long, angry email. They'll blame everybody else. They'll change their story or casually say something that sounds like an admission without realizing it. And that's why one of the most dangerous instincts in these situations is, well, I'll just explain everything myself. Because in licensing matters, over-explaining can be a real problem. Not because the truth doesn't matter, but because once you start talking too much, especially in writing, you can accidentally create admissions, contradictions, or statements that make the issue look worse than it needed to. This is where most plumbers get into trouble. Not at the inspection, not even necessarily when the complaint first comes in, but in the response. Because once someone feels accused unfairly, the instinct is usually, well, I need to clear this up right now. Or I'm going to send them every screenshot, every text, every detail. I'm going to show them exactly why this wasn't my fault. And look, I get it. That is a human reaction. I would probably have the same reaction if somebody filed a bar complaint against me. But that's also where a manageable issue can turn into a much riskier one. So we're going to talk about 4 common mistakes. And the first one is over-explaining. So you really need to take your time because trying to win the whole thing in one rushed email or emotional statement is not the way to go about it. The second common mistake is treating the meeting with the board's investigator too casually. First off, the board's investigator is not your friend. Even though he'll act like it, he is not your friend. Number 3 most common mistake, letting a board investigator or staff member pressure you into signing an affidavit or agreement. I'm not messing with my plumbing. I'm going to call you. So why would you sign a legal document that impacts your entire career without having a lawyer review it? And the 4th most common error that I've seen is hiding behind delegation. So saying something like, well, my crew handled that. When the real question is going to be, what did you, as the license holder, actually supervise? And that last one is a big one in trade cases. Because if the complaint suggests the work was done under your license, one of the first things that may get looked at is whether your involvement was real or just assumed. And if that answer is vague, inconsistent, or unsupported by documentation, that can create a whole second problem. And that leads into what is probably the single most important issue in a lot of these cases. Here's the big takeaway today. Documentation often matters more than intent. A lot of plumbers are excellent at their jobs. They're hardworking people who genuinely believe hey, I wasn't trying to cut corners. I thought the work was acceptable and I plan to go back and fix that. I just didn't realize that this was going to become a complaint. And all of that may be true. But if this turns into a licensing issue, people may not evaluate the situation based on what you meant to do. They may evaluate it based on what the file shows. And that can include things like permits, inspection reports, correction notices, invoices, photos, text messages, emails, job site communications, change orders, and timelines, which is a very important one. Records of who was actually doing the work is going to be extremely important as well. So let's say Marcus is the qualifying license holder on several jobs at once. A complaint comes in over a code issue involving something like, let's say, venting or drainage configuration. So Marcus believes the issue is fixable. He also knows he didn't personally install that exact part of the work. But once the complaint gets reviewed, there's no clear proper trail showing who did the work, when Marcus supervised, what instructions were given, or how the issue was handled once it was discovered. So now the question isn't just, was this plumbing issue fixable? Now the question becomes, was this license being used responsibly? And those are two very different questions. That's why documentation can become such a huge deal in these cases. Not because perfect paperwork just magically fixes everything, but because weak documentation can make a problem look a lot worse than it may have been in actuality. So what should you actually take from all of this if you're a licensed plumber in North Carolina? First off, don't panic, breathe. Easier said than done, but also don't brush it off either. Because one of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming if I fix the work, this will all just magically go away. And sometimes it does. Sometimes it absolutely does not, though. And generally speaking, what matters early is not just whether the work can be corrected. It's whether you're thinking about the complaint the right way from the very beginning. That usually means slowing down and asking the following. What exactly is being alleged here? Is this really just about workmanship, or is this also about supervision, communication, or lack thereof, or professional responsibility? What documents already exist? What is already in writing? And what could I accidentally make worse if I respond too quickly? What we often recommend, generally speaking, is that licensed professionals treat the first response as more important than they think it is. Because once something is said or emailed or submitted in writing in other ways, it can be very hard to walk it back later. And in a lot of cases, the goal early is not to be the loudest person in the room. It's not to sound the most offended. It's not even to say the most. It's to be accurate, deliberate, documented, and aware that you may be dealing with a licensing issue, not just a customer issue. So that shift alone can create a major difference. So if you remember one thing from this video, let it be this. A code violation complaint can turn into a license problem much faster than most plumbers expect. And the risk is often not just the alleged defect itself. A lot of the risk comes from how the issue is documented, how supervision gets evaluated, and how the plumber responds once the complaint starts moving. That doesn't mean every complaint is fair, and it doesn't mean every code issue should lead to a discipline. But it does mean this is not something to treat casually, especially once it starts looking like somebody may be questioning your competence, your supervision, or your judgment as a license holder. If you're a licensed professional in North Carolina and you want to better understand how complaints and investigations can affect your license, consider subscribing to the channel. And if this topic was helpful, you should also check out my other videos on North Carolina board complaints and licensing investigations, because understanding the process earlier can make a real difference when these issues come up. Keep everything flowing for North Carolina. Hope you have a fantastic day. Bye-bye.